Hello and welcome to the Music Professor channel. My name is Matthew King. If you like the channel, please like and subscribe and consider becoming a patron via the Patreon link below. We've got some patrons, but we'd love to have more. Or you can just give us a sort of one-off donation. Those are wonderfully welcome as well.
Please, sir, I want some more.
So today's discussion is about Frédéric Chopin, and I have to say I'm unapologetic about my pronunciation. I've had a few comments about pronouncing Chopin. There is a Polish pronunciation, but Chopin lived in France from the age of 20 and chose to adopt French pronunciation of his name, and that's the pronunciation that you'll find is the recommended pronunciation online, and it doesn't differ enormously from the way I say his name. Chopin, Frédéric Chopin. So there we go. But of course, feel free to disagree, but perhaps don't bother commenting. So today's discussion is going to be about the famous Raindrop Prelude, or to give it its proper title, Opus 28, number 15, the Prelude in D flat. And what I'm going to do to start with is discuss the background to the composition of the piece, and maybe say a few things about Georges Sand, about the famous trip to Majorca, and give a little bit of a background context. Maybe just discuss the preludes themselves as a collection very quickly. So between 1835 and 1839, when they were published, Chopin was working on this set of preludes, and I think he considered it a very significant part of his output. It was a big project for him. One of Chopin's big heroes was J.S. Bach, and I think it's very clear that he loved an aspect of Bach's work, which is the systematic quality of Bach's output. So Bach would frequently publish, or certainly compose, or sometimes publish, a very systematic collection of pieces. He did it over and over again. You have the Klavierübung, you have the well-tempered clavier, you have the 2- and 3-part inventions, you've got the art of fugue, the musical offering. All these things are sort of enormous, great, systematic collections of pieces. And famously in the well-tempered clavier, the 48, you have 2 sets of preludes and fugues in every key. And that's clearly Chopin's model here. Chopin composed the preludes as a set, a cycle, starting in C, first preludes in C, second preludes in A minor, the relative of C, and then the next preludes in G, and then you get its relative minor, E minor, and so on. So he goes all the way around the circle of fifths that way until you've covered all the keys. So it's wonderfully systematic. We get a piece in every single key. But the radical thing about this set is that on the one hand, you've got a sort of Bach-like systematic element, which you hadn't really had since Bach, not that I can think of, in this kind of key-by-key way. But what's absolutely different is that they're preludes without anything else. So he dispenses with the traditional fugue, even though Chopin's a wonderfully contrapuntal composer, I would say. He's not a fan of just sort of strict forms, old forms. It doesn't really interest him. So he dispenses with the fugues, and the preludes themselves are on display. And it's a sort of radical idea that you can have these preludes that are preludes to, well, nothing really. They're just ruins, as Schumann described them. They're just these sort of sketches or things that point to something possibly beyond them. But it's a bit of a mystery. And this is very romantic. This is the romantic sensibility, the idea that you can craft something that's rather elusive, something that's a bit mysterious, something that points to something bigger that might lie beyond. Ruins themselves are a big thing within Romanticism. I'll read you what Schumann said about the preludes. It's hard to say whether he admires them or whether he's critical. I think it's very likely that he's both, because Schumann absolutely revered Chopin, but was also troubled by aspects of his creativity. And he described the preludes as sketches, beginnings of etudes. I mean, 1 or 2 of them are fantastically hard. Or, so to speak, ruins, individual eagle pinions, all disorder and wild confusions. I sometimes think Schumann writes almost as well as he composes. And Schumann himself, an arch-romantic composer, had himself written such pieces. Many of Schumann's early piano compositions are sort of mysterious, radical, slightly sketchy, slightly ruin-like. So I think he's identifying with it, but possibly because Schumann later on in his career was drawn to more classical proportions, he's also troubled by what Chopin's done. Liszt, on the other hand, Chopin's great admirer but also rival, was much more sort of wholesale in his love of what Chopin had done. He said Chopin's preludes are compositions of an order entirely apart. They are poetic preludes, analogous to those of a great contemporary poet who cradles the soul in golden dreams. So he's just loving it. He's loving the fact that they're wild and weird, and indeed they are. And in fact, here's something else that's so marvellous about Chopin's Opus 28 Preludes. Every character you could possibly imagine is there, and some of the pieces are incredibly small. The famous waltz-like A major one. I mean, it's the simplest possible piece, and it's followed by the terrifyingly difficult and virtuosic F-sharp minor etude-like prelude. So he lurches from one character to another. It's absolutely thrilling, because it's as if, almost in Mahlerian terms, he's trying to encompass the world in these 24 short pieces. So just to discuss the Raindrop Prelude itself, the piece that we're really going into today, here's an interesting thing from Georges Sand, who was living with Chopin. They'd embarked on this holiday together in Majorca in 1838. They didn't want to be in Paris for the cold winter, so they went to this amazing ruined monastery at Valdemossa, this beautiful sort of romantic location. But the trouble was, it all seemed wonderful and romantic, but it was actually very wet and cold, and the locals were very suspicious of them because you had an unmarried man and a woman together, living together with her daughter. It all seemed very weird, and it was problematic. And she describes all sorts of incidents in a book that she wrote later called The Story of My Life. And she says some interesting things about Chopin. She says, his genius is the deepest, the most sensitive, and the most emotional in existence. He made a single instrument speak the language of the infinite. Often he could concentrate into 10 lines, which any child can play. Poetry of immense loftiness and a drama of unequalled action. He needed no complex material means to lend his genius a voice, no saxophones nor ophicleides to fill the soul with terror, and so on. So she says wonderful things about Chopin, very perceptive things, but she also says rather romanticized things about the background to the preludes, which have become famous. So I'll give you an example. Here's one passage. In such circumstances, he composed the finest, the circumstances are that they're in Majorca, he composed the finest of his short pieces, which he modestly called preludes. They are the works of a master hand. Many of them suggest a vision of deceased monks and the sound of funereal chants accompanying them to the cemetery. Others are melancholy and tender. They come to him in the hours of sunshine and good health, while the children were laughing under the window, and guitars twanging far off, and birds singing in the wet trees, and little pale roses bloomed against the snow. And so she goes on. That it's terrific writing, but it's a little bit romanticized, which is fine, no problem with that. But she starts telling this story about how she and her daughter went on this long, dangerous journey, and she says it was pitch dark and we were shoeless and abandoned by our driver. We hurried back, braving unheard of dangers, because our invalid, that's Chopin, would be anxious to see us, as indeed he was, but his anxiety had turned into a sort of quiet despair. We found him sobbing while he played his wonderful prelude. When we entered, he rose, uttered a loud cry, and said confusedly in a strange tone, "Ah, I knew that you were dead." After recovering his spirits and becoming aware of our plight, his retrospective view of our dangers made him ill, and then he declared that while waiting for us he had seen it all in a dream, and not distinguishing dream from reality had calmed, and as it were lulled himself by playing the piano, persuaded that he too was dead. He saw himself drowned in a lake with heavy drops of cold water falling rhythmically on his breast. I should say that Chopin had tuberculosis, so some of this kind of morbid stuff is connected to the fact that he wasn't very well. I made him listen to the noise of the water, she says, dropping at regular intervals on the cell roof. But he denied having heard it and even grew vexed when I described the phenomenon as mimetic harmony, in other words, harmony that was copying natural sound. He protested violently and with justice against the puerility of imitating in music the stimuli of the outer ear. Okay, and then at the end it says that evening's prelude was full of raindrops, beating on the Charterhouse roof, but they were transformed by his imagination and singing gift into tears falling on the heart. Now, that is a famous description, and it's a beautiful description, but it probably isn't really true, because we know that the prelude was actually sketched in Paris before they went on holiday. So much of the material for this piece already existed. But it is possible, I suppose, that there was a raindrop element. Now, here's the thing. We don't even know which prelude she's talking about because she doesn't name it. And Liszt, when he was writing about the Raindrop Prelude, he was convinced that it was the F-sharp major prelude. So you've got that wonderful, it's incredibly beautiful piece, that the movement of the left hand, the quaver motion. There's another critic of the period who thought that it was this one, the B minor with its repeating Bs. And its mournful left hand. So that's also a contender. But the general consensus has been that it was the D-flat prelude. So this is what we're going to be looking at. Whether or not this is therefore the Raindrop Prelude, or whether any of them were, did Georges Sand just make that up? We don't know. What I would say is that all of those pieces concern themselves in some way with quaver motion, with a sort of pulse, some version of pulse, often being interrupted or going in unexpected places. That is an obsession of Chopin's in these pieces. And this particular piece has a secondary element. It's both a study in quaver motion, because there's continuous quavers all the way through, except for the famous unvirtuosic cadenza at the end, the cry of pain, if you like, that we get right at the end of the piece. But there is continuous quaver motion all the way through. The other thing that the piece is famous for is the A-flats, the dominant pedal that runs all the way through, sometimes with a little sort of sighing figure, in a kind of unpredictable way. You can't quite tell when it's going to be there, but there it is, kind of pulsing away in a sort of irregular form. You might say that Chopin was playing into a long tradition of pieces written on one note, which goes way, way back to the Renaissance. It goes back to, for example, Henry Purcell wrote a number of pieces where there's a pedal point, and you get pedal point pieces all the way through. Often Bach plays with pedal points, or Berlioz famously, Chopin's contemporary, wrote pieces with pedal points. Schumann did as well. So it's common practice. It's a way of showing your skill as a composer, because you have a single note around which you organise all your harmony and melodic material. Okay, so there it is. It's a sort of invention in quaver motion and with a continuous pedal. And the melody is famous because it seems very beautiful. It's got this unique kind of cantabile quality, this singing sound, and a simplicity that's immediately attractive. As a melody, it's very simple. It just has an arpeggio drop, and then it climbs from the dominant up to the fourth of the scale, and then drops back. So it's really a rising and falling scale, and that seems a very simple thing. So what makes it so beautiful, I think, is the rhythm. It consists of all sorts of different types of long, short. So you've got long, short, long, and even longer, long, short, long, short, long, short, long, short, long. So you've got that sort of wonderful irregularity, and there's an irregularity in the pulse underneath. You could even say that rhythmically it organises itself. You don't really know if the beginning is the upbeat or on the beat. It's actually on the first beat, but it almost feels like a 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And then, so do you see what I mean? It's within the 4/4. there's this sense of things being organised in offbeat patterns. And those offbeat patterns are marked by the left hand, which comes in there. Do you see that chord? And that one and that one. So he sort of marks out the rhythmic points as he goes. And the left and the right hands are also playing a kind of duet. It's so brilliantly conceived pianistically with this third element, which is the quiet pulsing underneath on A flat with the little sighs. And then it stops, and instead of just going, instead of just having a bridging note, he always does this lovely embellished thing, and then he repeats it. Simplest thing, just repeats actually, comes to a full close, and then we get a little middle bit. Now this is really like a nocturne, isn't it? In fact, the genre that he's referring to, it's the longest of all the preludes, opus 28. The genre is very close to the nocturne. If you think of the B major nocturne from exactly the same period, from 1836, with these F sharps, it's a very similar kind of texture, very similar type of melody, lots of dotted notes. Really, you couldn't distinguish the two. And in this little middle episode, he does something else that's common in the nocturnes. I'm going to play from memory one of the opus 15 nocturnes. Look how the left hand and the right hand seem to be joined together, but not quite. Now they separate, but they start together. And here you've got a similar thing where the left hand, there it is, playing with the right, but not quite. And it drifts, almost in an Erik Satie-like way, I always think. I realise this is long before Satie. It drifts into the dominant minor. Then it repeats the tune, but harmonised differently. Coming round to B flat minor, the relative minor. And then he sort of sits on B flat minor in this very melancholic way until it just sort of settles on F, which of course is the starting note of the melody. So the melody comes back round, and embellishment is slightly different, slightly more complex. And this time he just leaves it, this is a wonderful poetic thing to do, he just leaves it open-ended on that E flat, and then we go into the dark, wonderfully dark middle section. So here we're, I suppose, entering what a lot of people find that the best bit in a way, the most exciting bit, almost reminiscent of Beethoven, a composer that Chopin revered, but also sort of publicly tended to criticise. He thought that Beethoven was a bit barbarous, a bit sort of over the top, but he was also hugely impressed by the dark, turbulent character of Beethoven's music. So here, enharmonically, we turn from D flat major to C sharp minor, which is actually the tonic minor. We haven't changed key, we've just gone minor, and he's notated it in C sharp minor, but we're in the same basic key, but minor. And here is, I wonder if Georges Sand's reference to ancient monks and so forth is what's going on here, because this is very like a liturgical chant, almost like a kind of gloomy Gregorian chant, almost like an orthodox chant, low down, like low male voices. And over the top of it, just this continuous, the A flat has now become a G sharp, and we got this wonderful effect of this lugubrious melody with the open fifth, which of course has a sort of resonance of the medieval, or of something mysterious or dark or primal. If you watch my video about Beethoven's Fifth, I talk about this in a very different context. The opening of Beethoven's Fifth is also the opening of Beethoven's Ninth is also an open fifth. But here, this mysterious sort of monk-like chant, and then the answer is so brilliant because it begins on the second beat. If he'd just gone 1, 2, 3, 4, it'd be boring. But it goes 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And because it comes in on the second beat, it's got this wonderful energy. Any composers out there, this is a little piece of advice. If you start your melody on an offbeat, on the second beat of the bar, it immediately has a forward momentum that it doesn't have if you start on the first beat. So Chopin starts on the second beat and it pushes to the open fifth again. Wonderful. And then he repeats it, but with octaves and the right hand joining in on some of the melody notes. And then this wonderful climax in E major suddenly goes to E major, but with these strange, instead of the dominant, which would be boring, it got E major and G sharp minor. Chopin often does this. He gives you a slightly twisted, slightly unexpected harmony. And then that augmented triad leading to G sharp minor, the dominant minor. Then he repeats the whole thing in a very dramatic way. And then the second half of the middle section, which is like a chorale. It's really like a sort of hymn, a tragic hymn, but with these dark bass notes, lots of suspensions and wonderful suspension, dissonant suspensions. He could have just sort of stopped here, but of course the proportions would be wrong. So what he does is he stays there and he does this wonderful, just 3 different chords. La da 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 da. Amazing, just the simplest little pattern of notes, and it creates this fascinating rhythm. 1, 2. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. So it's again one of these wonderful moments where he's playing with the rhythm, all these tied notes going across the bar, and we land on G sharp major, the dominant of C sharp minor, and he does it again. And then we get this wonderful dominant 7th suspension in F sharp minor, and then he throws us down to the dominance of C sharp minor again. That chord's rather beautiful, isn't it? With the added 6th on top of the G sharp. C sharp minors with an added 6th. That chord. Now, it's interesting because I think if Beethoven had written, he probably would have used a diminished chord there. And if Liszt had written it, he might have used an 11th. And if Mahler had written, he might have had a sort of Phrygian. But Chopin has this fascinating raised 6th, almost like a bell tolling, and then suddenly and beautifully it slips back into the innocence of the melody. This time with yet another embellishment, and then the melody just breaks off and we have 2 bars with this absolutely magnificent, completely unembellished cadenza, magnificent, a sort of cry, a very, very emotional moment, then sinking down into that beautiful and unexpected 11th chord, and then the resolution, and then the melody continuing just through a set of perfect cadence, but it's so simple and yet beautifully handled, and then finally dropping down onto the median, the 3rd of the chord. He loves the 3rd of the chord because in a sense it isn't quite resolved, and then the final chord. So Chopin's Raindrop Prelude, magnificent. Perhaps I shouldn't call it the Raindrop Prelude, but the piece that was described that way by Georges Sand, the great D-flat Prelude, the longest in the set, in the Opus 28 set. So now, here is a version of the piece being played by me in an earlier recording with just sort of annotated comments. So enjoy listening to it. Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe.